Welcome to Lecture 4, Functions of Attitudes. Introduction. In this lecture, we shall attempt to consider different functions of attitudes. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain the different functions of attitudes. Content. Attitudes serve a number of different psychological functions. Different people might hold the same attitude for different reasons, and a person might hold a particular attitude for more than one reason. The functions flounce how consistent it is with his or her other attitudes and how easily it can be changed. Over the years, attitude theorists have identified several functions of attitudes. We will discuss 5 of them here. The instrumental function attitudes that we hold for practical or utilitarian reasons are said to serve an instrumental function. They express specific instances of our general desire to obtain benefits or rewards and avoid punishment. For example, most Americans favor more government services but oppose higher taxes. As this example indicates, such attitudes are not necessarily consistent. To change such attitudes, the person needs only to be convinced that an alternative will bring more benefits. The knowledge function. Attitudes that help us make sense of the world, that bring order to the diverse information we may assimilate in our daily lives, are said to serve a knowledge function. Such attitudes are essentially schemas that permit us to organize and process diverse information efficiently without having to attend to its details. For example, before 1990, negative attitudes towards the Soviet Union helped many Americans organize and interpret world events in terms of the Cold War. The belief that Democrats just want to tax and spend, or that Republicans care only for the wealthy, provides a quick schematic way of interpreting and evaluating the proposals and candidates offered by the two parties. Like other schemas, such attitudes often oversimplify reality and bias our perception of events. Because value-expressive attitudes are derived from the person's underlying values or self-concept, they tend to be consistent. As noted earlier, both political values, such as liberalism or conservatism, can serve as a basis for value-expressive attitudes. Such attitudes do not change easily. The individual has to be convinced that alternative attitudes would be more consistent with his or her underlying values of self-concept. The ego defensive function. Attitudes that protect us from anxiety or from threats to our self-esteem are said to serve an ego defensive function. The concept of ego defensive mechanism comes from Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. One of the mechanisms of ego defense described by Freud is projection. The individual represses his or her own unacceptable impulses and expresses hostile attitudes toward others who are perceived to possess those impulses. For example, a person who is fearful of his or her own possible homosexual feelings is likely to deny having such feelings and display hostility towards gay people. In one study, students at a liberal California university were asked to write essays describing their attitudes towards lesbians and gay men. A content analysis of the essays revealed negative attitudes serving an ego defensive function in about 35% of the essays. Herrick, 1987. The notion that negative attitudes towards minority groups can serve as an ego defensive function is called the scapegoat theory of prejudice, because the person's hostility often takes the form of blaming those groups for both personal and societal problems. This theory was tested in the late 1940s by a group of psychologists at the University of California at Berkeley. The researchers sought to discover whether psychoanalytic theory could explain the kind of anti-Semitism and fascist ideology that had emerged in the Nazi Germany, and whether one could identify individuals who would be particularly susceptible to such an ideology. The research, described in a book titled The Authoritarian Personality, has become a classic in social psychology. Adomo et al. 1950. Using attitude questionnaires, the investigators first confirmed their hypothesis that individuals who were anti-Semitic were also likely to be prejudiced against many groups other than their own, that is, against out-groups. In interviews, such individuals recalled rigidly moralistic parental discipline, a hierarchical family structure, and concern about the family's socio-economic status. According to the investigators, such home environments produce individuals with authoritarian personalities, individuals who are submissive and obedient to those they consider their superiors, including authority figures, but contemptuous of and aggressive toward those they consider inferior. As the psychoanalytic theory of prejudice predicts, authoritarian individuals repress knowledge of their own undesirable characteristics, projecting them instead onto members of inferior outgroups. Although the authoritarian personality study has been criticized for a number of shortcomings, Christie and Jeholder 1954, many of its original conclusions have withstood the test of continued research. In particular, there does appear to be an authoritarian personality type that seems particularly susceptible to a fascist ideology with hostility toward outgroups of its core. More recent research suggests, however, that prejudice and authoritarian attitudes may be acquired more directly through normal learning processes rather than through the more involved psychoanalytic processes described in the original research. Also, the specific political content of an authoritarian outlook can differ from one society to another. A survey conducted in 1991 found that highly authoritarian versions tended to oppose individualism but supported equality, such as free and equal medical right for all, a pattern opposite that displayed by authoritarian individuals in the United States. McFarland, Ageyev, and Abalakina, Pub, 1992. The social adjustment function. Attitudes that help us feel that we are part of a social community are said to have a social adjustment function. The opinion molecules discussed earlier provide one example. Other examples can be seen in people who hold the prescribed beliefs and attitudes of a particular church or political party because their friends, families, and neighbors do. The actual content of the belief and attitude is less important than the social bonds they provide. To the extent that attitudes serve primarily to social adjustment function, they are likely to change if social norms change. This was demonstrated in striking fashion in the American South during the 1950s, when legalized racial segregation was being dismantled. Surveys showed that Americans in the South were generally opposed to desegregation and were more likely than Americans in the North to express negative attitudes towards African Americans. Some psychologists suggested that Southern Americans might be more authoritarian than Northern Americans, that racial attitudes in the South were serving an eco-defensive function, but Thomas Pettigrew, a social psychologist who specializes in race relations, argued that racial attitudes in the South were being sustained primarily by simple conformity to the prevailing social norms of the region, a social adjustment function, Pettigrew 1959. Using the questionnaire developed for measuring authoritarianism, Pettigrew found that Southerners were no more authoritarian individuals. In both regions were more prejudiced against African Americans or anyone. In fact, The South has historically been out of the least anti-Semitic regions in the United States, and one survey done at the time showed Southern whites to be unfavorable toward African Americans, but quite favorable toward Jews. Also, veterans from the South whose military experience had exposed them to different social norms were considerably less prejudiced than non-veterans, even though veterans from both South and North were more authoritarian than non-veterans. The subsequent history of desegregation confirmed Pettigrew's analysis. As desegregation progressed, surveys showed that attitudes towards a particular desegregation step tended to be unfavorable just before the change had been implemented, but became favorable soon afterward. Thus, some communities had accepted the segregation of public accommodations but were still opposed to school desegregation. Other communities showed the reverse pattern. In one study, it was estimated that about 40% of the sample had firm opinions favoring or opposing desegregation, but that the remaining 60% favored whatever the social norms happened to be at the time. Minard, 1952. It is often said that one cannot legislate attitudes. In a literal sense, this is obviously true, but legislation and judicial decrees change public policies and practices, and this in turn frequently had to the extent that a citizen's attitudes are serving a social adjustment function, they too will change. Under these conditions, the quickest path toward changing hearts and minds is to first change behavior by changing social norms. Summary: the students have learned the following: the different functions of attitude. End of lecture 4. Thanks for listening.